This video is sponsored by Crucible, a gaming convention held September 29th through October 1st that features a 3-day 100-player Warhammer 40k GT. More about them at crucibleorlando.com and later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and I have spent the last couple of weeks digging deep into the new Tyranid Codex. So what I'm going to be doing today is breaking down some of the most useful and powerful data sheets within the 10th Ed Tyranid faction, and ones that you should consider running in your lists. As always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, please give a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, do all the YouTube stuff. I'm going to start with some honorable mentions. These are units that are probably just good, but for kind of boring reasons. You should most likely be including them in all your lists just to score points and win games. And that, you know, those things are great to do, but it's less flashy than some of the other entries we're going to be talking about later. So, without further ado, we'll rip the band-aid off with Ripper Swarms. These things had a pretty simple buff in the 10th edition Codex to one of, honestly, the most important stats on their card, that being unit size. You can take them in units of 1 now, and that's the reason that they're good. They're OC0, they don't really contest objectives very well, but what they do is score you secondaries. For 20 points a model, they can screen out areas of the table, perform actions, and count as a unit for standing in a place for engaging on fronts or behind enemy lines. This makes the Tyranid secondary game plan basically as consistent as it was in the past, whereas previously you spent those points on additional Biovores. Now Biovores have been slightly nerfed. You can only create 1 Spore Mine unit per turn. Rippers have literally just sort of slotted right in there. You can take 3 individual Ripper Swarms in every list. They can drop into your opponent's backline or screen against their Deep Strikers, and you'll never feel bad about it. We just mentioned them, so I'll mention them again. Biovores are also in this section. They got a little bit of a points hike, but also became harder to kill, which is great, plus getting a gorgeous new model. Also cool, most importantly though, they can create a Spore Mine. Those Spore Mines can drop in, count as being in a place, and do actions, making it so that your actual expensive Tyranid units don't need to go do those things yourself. Honestly, the Spore Mines are pretty useful as well. Again, it's a single entity unit, so they're good for screening. If you find that the movement didn't quite work to screen out a particular area of the battlefield where your opponent could deep strike in or drop in strategic reserves, you can just plug that hole with a Spore Mine, which is nice. Last but certainly not least in this section, Gargoyles are the next unit we're going to talk about. Whereas the other 2 entries here are good just because of the fact that they are good at scoring secondary objective, Gargoyles are ludicrously useful for primary. Not to mention the fact that they're good for screening and move blocking as well. Gargoyles are supremely fast at a base movement of 12, and with the ability to move after shooting, they can go up to 18 inches without advancing. Their weapons are assault, which also means that they can advance on top of that. If you're playing them in a detachment like Unending Swarm, you can auto 6 that advance roll for 1 CP, allowing the unit to automatically, with no dice being rolled, move 24 inches, assuming that they can find something to make a ranged attack against, which is usually pretty easy if, again, you're moving 24 inches. At OC2, 10 of these will be able to steal objectives from almost anything in the game, and they have a relatively large base size on their large flying stand, which means that they're also good at stringing out across the table and preventing your opponent from moving. I almost always include 2 units of Gargoyles in every one of my lists, just because of the amount of board control and useful utility that they offer you, and I have never looked back.
In a world where every day is a battle for survival against all odds, every second a life or death struggle, and every achievement a victory bought with blood, tears, and lots of sweat, hundreds of cool gamer people will come together for 72 hours of epic tabletop gaming action. The name of the place is Orlando, Florida, and their arena of epic conflict, Crucible 2023.
I think I nailed that take, honestly. Absolutely destroyed that one. Crucible Orlando is a long-running miniature gaming event held in Orlando, Florida. Hence the name. Just really makes sense when you think about it. This year, it is happening on September 29th through October 1st. And while the Crucible event has over 10 years of tabletop gaming events under its belt, this year they have decided to expand, partnering with QuestCon to offer an unparalleled variety of events. These include RPG RPGs, board games, and of course, miniature events, such as tournaments and narrative games for BattleTech, War Machine, Infinity, Star Wars, Legion, Marvel Crisis Protocol, Malifaux, the Middle-earth strategy battle game, and of course, a 96-player 3-day Warhammer 40k GT. A GT so exciting and action-packed that I'm going to be covering it on this very channel. The Crucible Orlando team reached out to me looking for me to cover their event, and I'll be down there all weekend doing just that. So visit crucibleorlando.com to get your tickets today. And I'll see you on September 28th through October 1st, either in Orlando or on this very channel.
It's time to enter the Crucible.
So with those boring entries out of the way, let's talk about some flashier stuff. Units that are actually gonna just straight up murder your opponent. And the first one we'll talk about is my good friend, Harry Dan. This big aircraft is technically not in the Tyranid Codex, so I am cheating a little bit, but it is in the Imperial Armor Compendium for Tyranids. This is a huge Titanic aircraft, which gives you a lot of the benefits of the aircraft keyword, namely the return to old towering mechanics. Aircraft are the only units in the game that still use true line of sight for ruins, even if the target is not within the ruin. So, with a model as large as the Harridan, basically the size of an actual bus, these guys are going to be able to peek around corners and see stuff pretty effectively. On top of that, they have a large model size, but their base is relatively small in comparison. That's very useful with the 10th edition mechanics, which make it much easier to set up and place the Harridan on the table. Previous editions, no part of the Harridan's model could extend over the edge of the battlefield, which got real weird because the model extended maybe 12 inches off of where the base is. It's no longer the case in 10th edition, making the unit much easier to maneuver around. It does have some good synergies with specific detachments. I think Synaptic Nexus is the biggest one for it, granting an aura of reroll once to hit and wound, which is incredible for the Harridan's absolutely wild array of weaponry, and also a potential invulnerable save. The big downside of the Harridan is that for 600 points, it is easy to kill, and if you are playing it in aircraft mode, it can't really hide from stuff. Honestly, it's big enough that it can't really hide from stuff anyway, so you can almost always assume that people are going to have line of sight to this guy. That said, with the ability to enter into aircraft if your opponent can kill it, you can ensure that it can always enter strategic reserves. Because of the way aircraft works, despite the fact that it is normally large enough that it would be too large to strategic reserve legally, the aircraft mechanic enters you into normal reserves and then converts you to strategic reserves after the game begins. It's really weird, but it's worded that way so that you don't bump the strategic reserve limit when calculating your aircraft in reserves. With two D6 plus 6 shot dire biocannons coming in at a ludicrous strength 10 AP3 3 damage profile, with the ability to potentially suffer mortal wounds to get +1 to wound on those biocannons, the Harridan is able to alpha strike most things in the game that can pose a threat to it, although it doesn't have the same level of absolutely nutty damage output that it did in 9th edition. This thing is still pretty good to kill most heavily armored vehicles in the game when it arrives. Now that said, the Harridan is relatively fragile. It is only toughness 10 with a 3+ save and doesn't have any built-in defensive mechanics. You can add some in depending on the detachment that you're in, and I would almost always recommend you take a detachment that can protect the Harridan at least a little bit and or buff its damage output as well. It has a high attack volume, but it is relatively spiky, so if you don't have rerolls or any additional weapon buffs for those biocannons, the Harridan could get a little bit unfortunate. That said, in the detachments that make it work, I think the Harridan is a pretty good and cool include. As long as you're okay with running a model that's as big as it is. It's physically large, which does make it kind of difficult to maneuver around the table, but it does mean that it basically always has cover, so that's kind of nice, I guess. Moving on, the Exocrine. These guys are efficient. They have a pretty solid gun that goes kind of crazy once you start applying additional attack modifiers to it. Giving this thing lethal hits or sustained from Invasion Fleet or giving it rerolls from Synaptic Nexus all are pretty good, especially given the fact that it is heavy, so a lot of times the Exocrine can hit on 2s, which is solid. And on top of that, as a little bit of gravy, it also buffs the rest of your shooting with access to rerolls, which is not something that Tyranids have wide access to. Honestly, the Exocrine is phenomenal phenomenal. I think most Tyranid armies, especially if they are running even a modicum of ranged attacks, would benefit from at least one Exocrine, just to be able to answer relatively resilient infantry squads. It is like sort of a heavy infantry sweeper. Shooting at things like Terminators, it has an almost perfect profile, which is very good. And it can also plink a couple wounds off of a tank. Usually it's good for 3 to 6 damage, and then grant rerolls to things like Zoanthropes that can actually finish the job. I'm glad that Exocrines made the transition over to 10th edition. They were good in 8th and 9th, and continue to be playable in 10th in a very different capacity than they did in the past, but I'm here for it. I think these guys are amazing, and I don't think they're going anywhere. Next up, we're going to talk about another big tanky boy, the Maleceptor. Tyranids really need a frontline unit that can hold down mid-board objectives. Kind of the Tyranid game plan is to annoy your opponent into coming into the middle of the table to fight whatever you have in the center, so that your short-range shooting and melee stuff can actually counterpunch and kill their army. Tyranids are kind of a reactive army right now, and one of the best ways to react upon is somebody trying to kill a Maleceptor. These guys, for their points value, a points value that was only increased by 5 points in the data slate update, which was very good considering it's another unit that many armies play in 2 or 3s. Have a high toughness value, solid saving characteristics, the 3+ armor and 4+ invulnerable save, and if you are within 6 inches of them, which often happens, you are -1 to hit and potentially -1 to wound. On top of that, the Maleceptor has mediocre melee, but an excellent ranged attack. And while it's not able to shoot while it's in melee, and oftentimes the Maleceptor will find itself engaged, it is able to fire out of melee. So what you can often do is just toilet bowl enemy units around the Maleceptor, wait for your melee stuff to get into range to clean them off, and the Maleceptor continues to shoot at something elsewhere on the table. It's not very long range, but that's usually not a huge problem because the Maleceptor is in the middle of the table anyway. And they're cheap enough that if they die, unlike larger units like Norn Emissaries, you're not that worried about it. It's okay. Honestly, I think these guys are kind of what the Norn Emissary wants to be. The Norns ended up being extremely expensive, almost double the cost of a Maleceptor. And while they do have a significant improvement in resilience and objective control, I think the Maleceptor just ends up being more efficient. It's probably a composition with both of them in there, though. They kind of wombo combo together pretty well. The other thing that the Maleceptor does is potentially protect the rest of your team. Its aura of -1 to hit and potentially -1 to wound doesn't care who you're attacking. It just cares about whether or not you're in range of the Maleceptor itself. So the Maleceptor can oftentimes debuff your attacks targeting other Tyranid units. And that moves us on to the next entry, the Deathleaper. She went down a bunch of points in the data slate update and got an improved save. I think they were trying to make up for the fact that the Deathleaper did get a larger base and physically larger model, both of which are actual debuffs to a unit that operates like the Deathleaper does. That said, 70 points for a Lictor with strikes first, a good melee profile, an extremely strong defensive stat line, lone operative, forward deploy, and the ability to randomly clear out characters and potentially battle shock enemies. Forcing additional battle shock checks is a huge part of the new Tyranid Codex, and as we'll talk about with some of the later entries in this video, is crucial to Tyranid gameplay. That for only a couple more points off of over a normal Lictor is a steal. The biggest downside to Deathleaper is that unfortunate character keyword. Because of the situations in which the character operates, it is oftentimes in threat of your opponent's army, and will oftentimes give up assassination if your opponent draws the card. That is the biggest drawback to the Deathleaper, but other than that, there's basically no reason not to include her in almost all your lists. Forcing battle shock checks on people is great. Having a strikes first lone operator in the middle of your opponent's army is great. Having a strong invulnerable save and good save characteristics is also great, backed up by stealth and, again, lone operative. It's just all coming up gravy for the Deathleaper. Moving on from there, we're going to continue to talk about new and exciting resculpts. Let's talk about the Pyrovore. I don't think this is a real surprise to anyone, but these guys basically kind of are good for the same reason that Ripper Swarms are good. For 30 points, you get a single model. That's already pretty solid, and especially a model that's hard to kill. Pyrovore's just straight up got a statistical improvement in the 10th edition Codex from the index, where they had less wounds. They went up in wounds, but didn't go up in points value, which is solid. Their base size did get bigger, and that is a big detriment to the unit. Being a slow infantry model, they can move through walls, but only if they can clear them, which kind of means at this point that a lot of times they have to be advancing in order to actually clear the wall, and that prevents them from shooting their gun unless they have a nearby Hive Tyrant. That said, the defensive efficiency for 30 points, the base size actually isn't that bad if you're using it to screen. Both of these things are great. It's a strong utility unit, and on top of that, it can also supercharge your shooting. Giving everything ignore cover against whatever the Pyrovore shoots at is huge, and you can wombo combo that together with the Exocrine to get rerolls and ignore cover stapled together to allow this guy to supercharge your entire army. Pyrovores are another unit that I think most lists want to include at least one or two of. These guys are good enough that I think it's going to make getting that new resculpted model kind of difficult, if I were to hazard a guess. Moving on to a unit that's going to be much easier to acquire, however, the Neurotyrant. This one was a model that I wasn't sure of when it initially released with the Index. However, it got significant changes in the Codex proper. It did get an expansion to its Neuronode ability, so it can provide synapse to units at a greater distance, which actually synergizes with a lot of the forward operating lone operators that Tyranids are incentivized to take. If you have things like Lictors and Von Ryan Sleepers up in the front of the table, you can easily give those things their extra resilience to battle shock checks by being in synapse, and potentially some stratagem efficiency as well if you are in a detachment that cares whether or not you're in synapse range. On top of that, it has just a good flamer and is kind of hard to kill, with kind of mediocre toughness and wounds, but protected by a 4+ invulnerable save and the fact that it's not that expensive, so even if your opponent overextends to kill it, you're not that worried about it. But really, the pièce de résistance on this datasheet is their ability to subtract 1 from Shadow in the Warp battle shock checks. As I mentioned before, and we'll talk about momentarily, battle shocking enemy units is the name of the game for a lot of compositions in the new Tyranid Codex. Shadow in the Warp went from being just sort of a mediocre and honestly kind of bad ability to being super powerful with the introduction of units like the Neurolictor. And being a 2d6 roll, battle shock checks are actually more or less likely to fail based on your leadership on a bell curve. Going from needing a 7 to needing an 8 to pass your battle shock is a huge statistical difference. So you have a solid unit who's relatively cheap, has a good flamer and a good support ability, and also turbocharges your army ability. Now, last but certainly not least, and in fact, what I think is honestly maybe the best unit in the Tyranid Codex, the Neurolictor. Just looking at this thing's top line profile is pretty solid. It's an infiltrating lone operative that it has 7 wounds protected by a 4+ invulnerable save for whatever reason. Those are good stats. It's a utility unit that is extremely hard to kill, can't be shot at outside 12 inches, and even if you are within 12 inches, oftentimes just straight up doesn't die. Already we're coming up pretty good. On top of that, it also forces battle shock checks in your own command phase. This is pretty useful for flipping objectives back to your control if your opponent runs over to contest it. If you have 1 or 2 Neurolictors in range, there's a pretty solid chance that they will simply fail that battle shock check and not in fact contest your objective, and even the single Neurolictor itself, compared to a battle shocked enemy, will steal the objective away. While there's no pro action in the ability, it is only used at the start of your turn, so it's up to your opponent to cooperate with you to trigger it. You can put Neurolictors in compromising positions where your opponent is forced to run into the bubble. You can make it so that, for example, a Neurolictor is around 4.5 inches away from the control zone of an objective. So if they're about 4 inches behind the 3-inch bubble around an objective marker, the entirety of that objective control area is going to be within 12 inches of the Neurolictor. If your opponent comes up to take that objective, they are forced to take a battle shock check on your next turn. You can also put them in similar positions where they're just behind your frontline units, forcing enemies that charge into them to then be taking battle shock at the start of your next turn as well. That the Neurolictor also has another ability that keys off of battle shocked enemies, giving them -1 to hit, already pretty sweet, and your own army +1 to wound if they're within 12 inches. This means that the combination with the Neurotyrant is extremely favorable. You want to be forcing a lot of battle shock checks on the beginning of your opponent's turn, especially if they're going to be coming into you to steal your objectives. If you do so and Neurolictors are sitting behind your front line, you're basically going to be blanketing their entire army with -1 to hit. Then they also improve your own counterattack, giving you +1 to wound and giving Tyranids an actual outlet for high toughness enemies. Between Shadow in the Warp and 1 or 2 Neurolictors hovering around the center of the table, oftentimes enemy bricks that come into the middle will be forced to take 2 or 3 battle shock checks. The likelihood of them failing one of those is extremely high, and then your entire army keys off of them. They're not able to use reactive stratagems because suddenly they're battle shocked, and most units in the game will not be able to suffer the onslaught of the Tyranid swarm. That turns on your relatively mediocre ranged attacks on units like Maleceptors and Exocrines and allows them to punch well above their weight class, getting to the equivalent of strength 11 or 12 usually. While again it's detachment dependent and some detachments really need to take specific support units, it's my opinion that almost every detachment would be behooved to take at least 1 to 2 Neurolictors, and honestly, most Tyranid armies should be including 3. Even if all you'd use them for is controlling objectives and scoring secondaries at the beginning of the game, that's already worth the points investment, but on top of that, you can also use them to dramatically improve both your survivability mobility, ability to control primary objectives, and offensive output. Neurolictors literally benefit your army in every stage of the game and aren't even that bad at fighting. They hit on 2s and have an AP2 weapon with a bunch of attacks. Well, they don't fight first, so they don't take charges as well as standard lictors do. They occasionally can precision out 3 wound enemy characters or just clear a bunch of infantry for you just fine. There's like honestly no downside to the Neurolictor. They're just super good. And with that, those are my picks for the best units in the new Tyranid Codex. I'm gonna play some more games with this Codex before I come out with some more concrete thoughts about the different detachments and a full holistic tier list of the units in the faction. So let me know down in the comment section if you agree with my list of best units, and if you have any other entries that you think I should have included, and what you think a final power ranking of the detachments in the Codex will be. And with that, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Huge thanks to Crucible 2023 for sponsoring this video, and big thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.